guys, what is going on? Red Master here, and welcome back to another episode of Cards and Castles, everything you need to know. Now today we will be tackling the last and final faction, well aside from neutrals, but I guess we'll see if I want to do a video on the neutrals. But we are doing the video on the druids, wrapping up the last of the factions per se. Again, neutrals are in their kind of own zone, but I will warn before this video starts that this may be a shorter everything you need to know video because the druids are of course relatively new. If you just joined us within the between January and April, you would have maybe thought the druids have been here a while, but in fact the druids are of course new to the game compared to the other existing factions. They of course got released this past January, so going a little over 4 months now. So there is quite a lot to talk about with the druids, but with that being said, let's just jump right into it, I would say, because might as well, right? So where to start with the druid faction? Now, the druids are primarily a nature-based faction. They tend to use a lot of, I guess, well, obviously, what you say, nature-type abilities and creatures, no less. But they do have a couple of interesting faction abilities that actually have made the druids somewhat stronger, because I think without some of these they may not be they may be pretty much a dead faction, which no one really wants. So what do the druids possess that make them unique? Well, they do have Spirit Link, of course, a relatively newer ability, but one that we see Manticore has, and it essentially directs enemy combat damage, or redirects combat damage, I should say, to whatever unit has a Spirit Link, which is very useful, of course. With units taking pretty much, like, say, like a Manticore just sitting up there, and you advance a unit or two, and then that unit gets hit by something else. That damage is being redirected to Manticore, and that includes all of it. Chain. I don't know if explosive damage redirects to it, but I know chain does. Knockback does. All damage that could have possibly be taken by one or multiple units are usually redirected to a Spirit Link unit. So that is, of course, very useful. They also have Rampage, which, for those of you who remembered, that used to be sort of a general ability where we saw a bunch of different units have it. Primarily, I think Fenrir was the biggest sort of Rampage advocate. I think he doesn't really have that anymore. Oh, actually, no, he does, because he's actually in Druids now. I forgot about that. But yeah, he's got the Rampage now, sticking with Druids. So I think Vikings were the guys who used to use Rampage. That's now a sole Druid ability, which of course adds to their popularity a bit. And finally, they do have Companions, which, if you guys remember Rally, the thing that Doomship used to have, it's essentially that, only magnified to be on nearly every unit. So essentially what this guy does, you can play him to the right, left, above, or below a unit that you have on the board, and he acts there. Like, you summon him there, and then he'll run up, hit something from that space that he's on. So I think Companion is a relatively upgraded and much better version, or more competitive version, of Rally. Rally was never really that. I mean, it was alright, but with the units that had it, that really only being Doomship, you couldn't really get a solid Rally deck. I mean, don't want to toot the horn here, but Doomship was a great example that used Rally well. I think really they haven't the Doomship deck, the original Doomship deck, hasn't really, hasn't really sprouted since then, and I don't think it might ever. But I think Companions do what the Doomship deck essentially does, or what Doomship used to do very well. And again, hence why Druids aren't really a dead faction right now, because you can use these Druid Companions as a sort of building removal, which a lot of players think the game kind of lacks at the moment. So again, pretty good use there. But trying to think of what else I can say. I mean, that's pretty much it for the Druid abilities. So with that being said, let's hop into the strength of some of these Druid cards. So when you're mentioning about trickery and their strength, you can't really analyze that all too well. And I say this now because the Druid cards, or the Druid faction as a whole, again, fairly new here, and to a lot of players, it doesn't really have the support, or, doesn't have enough cards for it to be, very powerful or very useful at the moment. But for what they do have, I think there are some strengths to be mentioned here. Specifically, the companions that I mentioned, those work really well. And if you're not running, like, druid focused decks, but you want to use the druid faction, you may be seeing at least a companion or two in there, whether that be Centaur or Spiny. I'm trying to think if there are any other companions. Hell, even maybe Forest Watcher, the previously named Titan Watcher. But that's not to say like the druids don't also have a lot of solid abilities and tricks. They do have the not the druids. They have the Trents now. Those were used to be a big problem. I think before TEG. I mean, I don't know if it was before TEG. I think it was, but for like, you would see people running like Wood Wars, which Trent's old name, and then the what is it? The Forest. I don't know if it was called Forest Revolt. It might have been. Again, I'm sort of blanking out here, but essentially you just give a bunch of Wood Wars movement. That used to be the standard for any deck that you'd play, like the whole Wood War engine. But I think being moved over to Druids, they haven't completely died out in power. They're still relatively useful, but I think maybe Druid. I keep saying Druids because it's just so much easier to roll off the tongue than Trends. I guess I don't know, but I know they do some good stuff with the trees here. I know that's a good strength of theirs. They also do have, I think, one of the more higher base stated units. Aside from Dremoth, that thing is Dremoth. But I think Ancient Arbor, the 8/8, might be one of the stronger base stat lined units currently in the game, rivaling I think only a few, and I mentioned those few. Dremoth. You possibly just throw in Ragnar to that with the 210 chain 5, so it's really a 710. But yeah, I think when you're looking at the Druid faction as a whole, their strength lie in the different things that they can do. Again, they're not really focused. They don't really have one attributed strength. They don't all have a common strength. They all have different things, and that kind of goes true for a lot of factions. But the factions that are already out, they already have like a defined purpose on what they're used for and whatnot. Druids, not so much. So it's really hard to assess strengths when when you want to talk about druids. And I would say that's kind of the same thing for weaknesses. We haven't really, I mean, druids haven't really been played around with a lot since TEG launched. There's been a couple druid decks out there. I have a couple of druid decks myself. I mean, hell, FOD, that's a druid deck. I definitely had fun with that one. And I don't know if it's gonna reach 3K again this season. I'll have to push that in another ranked with red. But I'm getting off topic here. I think just overall strength and weaknesses are still kind of yet to be determined. But I would say maybe for a weakness, I would say, I mean, the heavy reliance on each other might be an issue. Because, I mean, when you think about it, you have a lot of units. And what I kind of mean by that is they're not super useful. I mean, you have cards like Call for Aid, Ancient Arbor, Liana, which are amazing. But, I mean, like, Beastmaster, if you kill off the Beastmaster, every other beast falls. Reliance there. The companions rely on other units, so if your units are dying, then you can't get the companions out effectively. Another example, Spirit Links, they kind of take away the damage, true, but that's like a temporary shield. And you can't really utilize that Spirit Link unit because you want him to be a shield. You don't want him to be out there open to take other attacks, thereby sort of mitigating the whole Spirit Link aspect. So I might put that out there as sort of the reliance on each other might be a weakness, but I want to hold that until we see more druid cards. Again, I'm keeping this message going, but that's really the blunt of it. Like that, you can't really assess the druids all too much because they need more cards. They need a more defined role, and right now they just don't have that, in my opinion. They don't. I mean, you can go around and be like, yeah, they have companions and Spirit Link, and they use that, and that's their those are abilities. They're not really like overall. That's what the faction is used for. Like ninjas with movement, Vikings with buffs, Crusaders with heal. Like these guys, they don't have that, in my opinion. They just don't. And again, I sound like a broken record here, but it's true. They need more cards, and that's where I lie on that. And that's really why I mentioned this video is going to be shorter, because I'm trying to think of things I could say for these guys, but, I really can't go into that until I get into individual cards, which we will, of course, get into very shortly. So as a faction of the whole, they have much development ahead of them. I hope that they get more cards, whether that be in more event cards, hopefully, or updates, balance patch wise or expansion wise, where they get another card dump. Well, not. I mean dump in a good way. Just getting more cards added into the faction. But yeah, that's really where I stand on the druids. Um, so with that being said, let's move into the cards. I think those are the more important aspects to touch on for this video, this episode of everything you need to know. 'Cause I think with the faction again at the moment, it's more, you know, let's look into some individual cards, the ones that are more prominent, to really show the druid strengths and or weaknesses. The first card I want to talk about today is the Seed of Regrowth. Now, for those of you who have watched my Forest of Devastation video, you'll know that I am a huge advocate for this card. I love what it does. I think it's probably one of the more powerful cards that Druid, has at the moment. So the Regrowth Seed is actually a trap. When your unit is destroyed, summon a Trent with full health. Now we know by the Trent it is a 3/5 at a standard, but essentially what the Regrowth does, it'll mitigate that that initiative damage, and it'll go up to and bring a Trent out with full health. So now it becomes a 3/5 that's summoned potentially pretty close to your opponent's castle. If you want to, or say have moved an aggressive Salahar Rider or Lumberjack up, now they're sitting with a 3/5 left to deal with. They just got rid of your Lumberjack or Salahar Rider, probably with a weakened or now dead unit. And now you essentially you've got a 3/5 there waiting to hit face. And on turn 2 to 3, 3/5 is pretty difficult to remove unless they're ramping out into maybe a 4 gold or 5 gold, potentially. But it's why I like this trap so much. It catches people off. It catches so many people, that's what I'm going to say, off guard, that they don't know how to respond to a 3/5 Trent that's just sitting there now, and they might even waste a couple of cards that they weren't expecting to use now because you've got the 3/5 unit, and you could also take a couple of castle shots off, maybe doing 6 or 9 if you're lucky damage to the castle. And if you want to buff that tree up with, say, a following armory or blacksmith, it's going to do even more damage. So I think the power of just lying in wait and then pop a 3/5 tree is incredibly dangerous, incredibly powerful, and paired with some of the other cards out there, whether they be global buffs like armory or blacksmith, or the Forest of All card, I did mention that earlier, where it brings all the Trents up to full health. So after your tree gets damaged, maybe per se, heal it up and summon another tree. But so now they're both at 3/5 or whatever full health you have them at. I think that's incredibly strong. So it's why I definitely like Seeds of Regrowth. Probably one of my favorite Druid cards of the entire faction, in my opinion. And our next card will be the Centaur. Now, I didn't mention earlier when I was going over the companion abilities that Centaur has become, in a way, the Druid building removal. And you can't really deny that, in a sense. For 4 gold, you get a 3/3 companion, which of course summons directly next to whatever unit you may have out on the board. And of course, the Centaur will get to move and attack as per its summon. So, I think this is probably one of the best companion cards currently out there compared to the other ones. That being Spiny and Forest Watcher. I don't think there are any else. I might be wrong about that. But the 3/3 is probably what makes this card so prevalent in any sort of Druid deck you see running, because it can reach out and take care of pesky buildings, the armories, the altars, the schools, the estates. All of the top tier buildings right now are viable to getting killed by a Centaur. Now, of course, there are a couple of buildings that don't, that barely, or I wouldn't say barely, they kind of escaped the Centaur's attack, and that being Temple of the God, or Five Gods, and Church, off the top of my head. 5 and 4 health respectively, so not every building's gonna die to Centaur, but I think with I don't want to say meta, but I think in a environment where you're seeing a lot of buildings being used, and of course armories, altars, schools, estates, I think if you're running the Druid deck, it's not hurtful, it's not gonna harm you to carry a Centaur. So that way, if a building becomes a problem, you can lunge out a unit and then lunge out a Centaur to ultimately get rid of a building. And I think that's a pretty good trade, regardless, because you're getting rid of something that might potentially harm you for the rest of the game if you leave it out. So for that reason, I think Centaur, very strong card, and probably one of the best companions of the Druid faction. Moving along our list, we do have the Call for Aid. Now, Call for Aid is an interesting legend of the Druid faction. It is one of the newer ones to get added to the game with TEG, compared to I think the other two cards that were, well, Seeds of Regrowth actually got added at the same time Call for Aid did. So it is a relatively new card. It adds 2 Northland Rangers to your hand, and they both reduce down to 5 costs. Of course, taking the 2 discount from 7, you'll get a 5 cost unit. And having that I think is pretty useful. 2 7/8s in your hand, ready to go at any time, can be pretty dangerous. Discount, um, Ranger, of course, is 7 gold for a reason. His stat line's incredible for what you're paying, and to have that that body, it's not said ability there, to have that body for even less gold, furthering the point of why I think Call for Aid is incredible. And you're getting 2 of them too, not just 1. You're getting 2, so it definitely fits the whole. I guess the Ranger protects the environment, so I guess that's a nice spin off that. But overall, I think Call for Aid a very strong way to get additional bodies into your hand and out on the board, especially 7/8 for you're gonna be killing off a few things with 7/8. Well, actually, not a few things, a majority of things with that 7/8, unless there's some buffs. But buffs are crazy to talk about as it is. So I think for that reason, Call for Aid, very strong legendary. And one that's kind of overlooked in my opinion. As I said, you don't really see a lot of people running Call for Aid because it does take some time to actually play this card to its full potential. Playing it at the right moment to get those bodies when you know that your opponent needs a break, and then of course playing those Northland Rangers following up. It does take some time to pull off this combo, but it is a very strong one nonetheless. So, with that being said, Call for Aid, definitely a solid card. And next up, I move to Fenrir. Now, Fenrir, of course, an old favorite of various players. I know that. I mean, he's been a good card. Let's put it that way. He's been a fun card to use. Originally being in the Viking faction, I had that ridiculous whole 4 movement. I can reach out and then run away and hit you kind of deal. So Fenrir was all sorts of crazy. Um, the Rampage, of course, makes him what he is, so I think keeping that was a good choice. He still retains that sort of Fenrir identity, maybe, if you want to think of it like that. But his new ability is quite interesting, gaining 1 attack whenever any unit on the board is injured. So that includes, if you're doing a combat with, a combat interaction, you're getting +2 attack for Fenrir. So you can ultimately build this up to be a very dangerous and eventually even a 1-turn killing creature. The 3/5 though is where it sort of retains the sort of, it's the boundary between like a good and overpowered card. You don't want this card to be very dangerous and all of a sudden have like this 21-10 monster on the field. I think 3/5 is a good place for it to start, and it gives players like some time to really snipe off Fenrir if need be. But I think the ability for him to just incredibly ramp up fast into a 1-turn killing creature through various combat interactions just makes him a very, very strong card. So I think Fenrir's change to Druids a very good thing for him to keep him alive, to keep him fresh in in the world of cards and castles. And for our final card today, I did want to touch upon the Ancient Arbor again. Now, I know there's some other Druid cards that are worth mentioning. Of course, Liana is definitely one of them. Hell, maybe even Bestial Rage you can classify in there too. But I want to talk about Ancient Arbor because he is pretty much an untapped, full of potential unit, in my opinion. 8/8 is one of, like I said, the near strongest baseline statted units in the entire game right now. And to see this 8/8 body at 6 gold, despite being slow, is still a tremendous threat to players facing him. I know when I played my Arbor, players don't really know what to do about him. They make these weird trades that just don't really work for the Ancient Arbor, like how they work for maybe some other units that they face that has this kind of health. And like Dremoth is definitely one of those units that are people just don't know what to do when they see him. And I feel like with Ancient Arbor, that's sort of the same way. You're faced down with these big stats, and you're like, oh crap, what do I really do about this? And that's where things like buffs become useful with Ancient Arbor, obviously. Drain Life, I know, is probably one of the best. Well, Drain Life is overall just a strong spell card, but things that like buff Ancient Arbor or dealing like burn damage as well. I mean, I guess those can really work with Ancient Arbor because you're not only burning the enemy resources, but you're pushing this 8/8 monster upon the enemy, so that's also something to consider. But again, I just wanted to take this time to highlight Ancient Arbor, untapped in my opinion still. Hopefully it gets used more within the future though, because he is definitely a unit that deserves it. And that being said, guys, that's going to end off today's video. Definitely feel like this has been like a more laid back episode of everything you need to know, because there isn't really much to go on with the Druid faction. As I mentioned, they are fairly new, about 4 months old at the time of recording, and they don't really have that sort of faction identity yet to really talk about or really to share with you guys. Hopefully they do get more cards in the future. They do definitely they're sort of a they do need more support, and I think with that right support, they can develop their own identity. They can develop themselves as a faction that everyone knows. Oh, this faction does this. Ninjas movement, Vikings buffs, Druids this. So I think it's only a matter of time for them. But if you think you have an idea of what the Druids may possess, so what is their faction identity, be sure to tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the matter. And while you're down there, be sure to give this video a like and share with your friends. And of course, leave those comments about the Druid faction down below. If you are new to the channel, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. Show the channel support. Help it grow. Help us reach, the sky, I guess. All by clicking that subscribe button at no extra cost to you. Good stuff. You don't need no Patreon. So with that being said, guys, until next time, stay gaming.